It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello, we're back here with a special. Keith's doing all the technology, driving all the mixing desk and everything, but I've got a special guest here with me. I'm JEHR-nehz-yay, and if you haven't listened to the podcast before, and with me in the studio, we have Yan Marquis. Waro, Yan.
Waro.
Comme tu la fais va?
Allah fait va bien, merci. Ete.
Va qui va? As you might have gathered, you're probably a little bit confused and wondering what we're talking about. I asked Yan how he was, and he replied, "Very well, thank you. How about you?" And I said, "Capital." That was a little bit of our local language, JEHR-nehz-yay, which Yan is proficient in, and I am very much not proficient in.
Although you did take lessons.
I did. You were an excellent teacher, so it's just that I don't use it enough. I really must make more.
And that is a problem, finding opportunities,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So just by way of introduction, Yan is a tour guide here in Guernsey, but also very much involved with promoting the local language.
Yes, that's right. So, I as you say, I'm a tour guide and I teach the JEHR-nehz-yay, the Guernsey language.
Yeah, and very much involved in doing translations for people and all sorts of things. I know I've had need to.
All manner of language-related activities.
Indeed.
Yes.
And what we thought it'd be nice to get Yan in to have a little bit of a chat to see what role the language played during the occupation, but also some of the stories that people have told him over the years, because Yan has spent quite a lot of time talking to people over the years in the language and about the language, and they've told him stories about their time during the occupation as well. So I thought perhaps we could maybe start with a little bit of that.
Yes. So I'm learning the language. I spoke to a lot of people that were here they just happened to be here during the occupation of Guernsey, or they'd been evacuated, but we spoke in JEHR-nehz-yay. I was also involved with various projects to record social history projects, and those often, in JEHR-nehz-yay, but the occupation came up often as a subject, as you can imagine. It was a big part of people's lives.
Indeed. And I think some of those recordings are on YouTube, aren't they? If people want to go and search them.
There's there's some on SoundCloud and searchable, yes.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. So you can go and search for those. I'll put some links in the show notes for anybody that wants to go and search those out. Now, we've all sort of heard stories from the occupation about people using the language. We had one which we've not been able to get to the bottom of, where there was a German soldier who could speak it fluently, which was a bit confusing to keep both Keith and myself when we came across this entry in a diary where I think it was Violet Carey, who lived up near the airport, was talking about she'd encountered this soldier who was deep in conversation with two ladies. But all a bit of a mystery, that one.
Yeah, yes, it is a mystery. I think we've both tried to find out more about this soldier, who it was. I think the soldier lived in the island before.
That's right, yeah. Apparently lived in the island for a number of years beforehand, and his wife and children were still here. He went back to Germany on holiday.
38, I believe.
Yes, in 38. And like a lot of Germans that went back to Germany in 38 and 39, found that he wasn't allowed to leave. So when he did get back here, he was delighted when he was, according to the diary entry, was delighted when he was sent back to Guernsey, thinking he'd see his wife and children, and then found out they'd been evacuated.
But I don't think it's that surprising that somebody, if I don't know, we don't know what his involvement was within the island, but at that time, pre-Second World War, JEHR-nehz-yay was very much the language outside of town that people would have spoken. It was people's first language for many.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's no surprises that anybody we don't know whether I married into the family or not. I don't know,
absolutely.
but whatever, that they would have had to have learnt the language. And something that is often overlooked is, you probably talked about this on other programs, about the evacuation. So there's about 17,000 people, which is about 40% of the Guernsey population, mainly women and children, but some men as well, were evacuated from the island prior to the occupation in June 1940. Now, a lot of those people, those children, women and children, did not speak much English.
Yes.
And that's often overlooked. And that caused quite a few problems, because not only did they not speak English, they were treated with people were quite suspicious of these people, these evacuees that didn't really speak English, not all of them, at least, very well. So
yeah, and while some of it sounds a bit like French, it doesn't, it doesn't sound completely like French. It's not like maybe if they'd learned French at school or something like that, they'd have gone, oh, that's a bit of a weird version of French, maybe. I'm assuming many of your listeners will not have heard the language, but it is actually quite un-French sounding. It's actually quite a Germanic sounding language, because of its origins being a variety of the Norman language, which was influenced by the Vikings, etc. I won't go into the history lesson of the language, but it actually, if you're not familiar, it does sound quite Germanic. So I have stories of people telling me that they were afraid of speaking the language when they were, in England during the war as evacuees. So they didn't, as I said, it was a bit of a problem sometimes. Yes. Yeah, I have read accounts of people being worried actually that they thought they were spies or something like that. Where are these strange people from?
And even with those that did speak English, you don't hear it so much these days, but there was quite a Guernsey accent, and it was peculiar. At least if you weren't familiar with it, it sounded a bit curious. And I think people were suspicious of these evacuees.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to have a bit of an accent, but I think we've all, well, most of us have kind of lost it over the years, unfortunately. But with you saying about it, Norman origins of the language, one of my friends who's a tour guide in France, Mag, she lives in Bayeux, and she was born in Normandy, and she can actually understand a little bit of it. She made mention of that the last time I was in France.
Well, that doesn't surprise me at all. As I say, we won't go into the history, but yes, it is essentially, it is classed as a variety of the Norman language, which was spoken. I mean, its origins are with the time of the Dukes of Normandy.
Yeah. Going back to the evacuation, I remember reading as well that the British authorities were, when they were organising the evacuation, they were actually looking for people who would act as interpreters, because they were pretty much convinced that nobody apart from sort of the government officials and over here were really going to be able to speak English.
Yeah, so I can believe that, because you had at that time, prior to the the Second World War, you would have had people that were what are called monoglots. They only spoke JEHR-nehz-yay. So yeah, I mean, it did change, and nowadays people just assume we've always spoken English, and that hasn't been the case.
No, very much not.
It's happened quite quickly, really, in a generation or two.
Yeah, and I find it quite sad actually that's been the case. But there are efforts, aren't there, to try and keep it alive, which is brilliant as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we're not alone. It's a global phenomenon, language endangerment. Yeah, we do our bit locally to try to reverse that shift, or at least raise awareness of the language. But again, the evacuation occupation is often seen as a turning point linguistically for the island, and certainly it didn't help things. But the language was already being considered threatened or in decline in the 19th century. So it hastened a language shift towards English. But while the evacuees, a lot of them, they didn't learn the language. They it wasn't spoken when they were at their billets in the UK. They spoke English. They learned a lot of English traditions, customs, but some did come back and learn it because, as I say, it was so widely spoken within within the families and the vineries, the greenhouses, and the tomato vineries that they had to learn the language to survive because it was very much still very, very current, very common.
And you would have been the one that sounded like the foreigner if you were only willing to speak in English, I'm guessing.
Well, I certainly have stories of people that, that they came back to the island not speaking any JEHR-nehz-yay, but they had to learn it because they had to get on. They wanted a job in, whether it be driving tomato lorries or picking tomatoes, packing tomatoes. That was the language people were speaking, so they did learn it. Also, some people, I'm thinking of my mother particularly, actually, she was evacuated. She was only, she was born about 6 months before, so she doesn't remember much of it, but she certainly didn't speak any JEHR-nehz-yay when she came back to the island. She'd been, she was in England, she was brought up, she learned to speak English, and within a few years, because there was so much language JEHR-nehz-yay spoken around the house in the greenhouses, and she was a little bit curious. She wanted to know what the people were talking about, so she learned the language. And there were so many, there were other people that tell the similar stories.
Yeah, and of course the language itself had a few benefits for people because the German soldiers couldn't necessarily understand it, could they?
Oh no! That has come out when talking to people that the Germans would get sometimes quite cross because what are you talking about? Speaking English, we don't understand you. So yes, but it was also it was used to some extent as a secret language.
Yeah, I remember talking to a gentleman some years ago, probably about 20 years ago, who I think he was 6 or 7 when the occupation began. And he told me that him and his chums from school used to find it great fun to talk about the Germans and be a bit cheeky to them in JEHR-nehz-yay, knowing full well that they couldn't possibly understand what they were up to. But he said as time went on, he decided to knock that on the head after he got a clip round the ear from a German soldier who clearly either just thought you're clearly being cheeky or just wasn't up for it.
Yeah.
So you mentioned people have told you some stories when you've been talking to them in the language. Are there any that sort of stick out for you in terms of the occupation times?
The story that often comes out is the wireless. The story about the wireless that, as you've probably said on other programs, the wireless, the radio for the news, they were confiscated, taken.
Yeah,
And yet, there are so many stories of people managing to hear or listen to the news. People holding back on, handing one in, handing in one of their wirelesses, and then keeping one back.
Yeah,
or crystal sets as well. So there are stories of people being out after curfew, turning up, going to listen to the news, which was. I think it was about 10 o'clock at night. So they were certainly out after curfew. They shouldn't have been out going to visit somebody's house to listen to the news, and a knock at the door. And there's a German soldier. Of course, everybody's terrified because you weren't supposed to be listening to the news and to have a radio. And the German soldier saying, "Oh, hello, can I come in and listen to the news too?" So these, I'm making light. Mustn't make light of it,
no.
But I think towards the end, in those last, the last times, the Germans themselves wanted to know what the news was, and that's not an isolated account. That's quite generic. That happened often.
Yeah, my great grandparents were here, and they had a couple of Germans billeted on them. One who was slightly nicer than the other one, shall we say? And I remember being told the story of, and unfortunately I never met my great grandparents. They both died before I was born on my mother's side. But they had one German that was billeted with them the Germans were allowed to have a radio. he had a radio, and he knew that they wanted to listen to the BBC after they'd been banned. And he used to come down in and say to them, "Oh, I'm just going out for a walk," and he'd leave his radio on and tune to the BBC, and he'd just basically go for a walk up and down outside the house to make sure they didn't get caught.
Yeah, so yeah, that sort of ties in with some the stories I've been hearing as well.
But yeah, there are quite a few stories about radios and things like that, and
I know what I was going to say. Yeah,
good.
Yeah, so continuing the story of radios, it also seems that occasionally somebody would be reported on, or so and so has a radio. For whatever reasons.
Settling scores,
I'm guessing. There would be a search of the property, and the radio wouldn't be, it wasn't found. And it makes me wonder how hard did they look? Because often it was either under the seat of a grandma who was sitting in the armchair, or in a saucepan on the stove, or
yeah.
There's all these stories, and you think, well, did they really want to find the radio?
I think there were varying efforts. There's a wonderful interview on the Imperial War Museum website with one of the German soldiers who was billeted over here, and as time went on, he actually started getting quite friendly with people. He was patrolling along Varzon,
yes,
and he started to get quite friendly. He could speak English. He was getting quite friendly with some people, just relieve the boredom as he's patrolling around the area. And he got sent a number of times to go and search houses. He'd have to lead a little patrol to go and search people's houses to see if they had radios, and his heart really wasn't in it. And he talks about in a couple of cases where people that had been nice to him and maybe given him a cup of nettle tea or whatever, that he actually actively helped them hide their radio. So he knew that it was in a sort of under a seat in the window and whatever. And so whilst his men were going around searching the house, he went and sat on that seat. So that they wouldn't, they weren't going to tell I think he was a sergeant. They weren't going to tell him to get up and get out of the way. He just went and sat there. But he also, I think it was him. If it wasn't him, it was another account where they talked about having gone and searched the house, but because the lady of the house had heard the Germans coming up the path and not wanting to be caught, had thrown the crystal set into a boiling pot of water on the stove. And when he walked past later on, her husband was not very happy. He was shouting at her.
Yes. So again, these tie in with the kinds of stories that people have.
They told you,
yeah. The other thing as well, on a language, from a linguistic point of view, is that German was taught to. It wasn't all age groups, but certainly there are stories of, many of the people I've interviewed were actually children. So, in some ways, they were protected from some of the not so pleasant side of the occupation, but they certainly talk a lot about school, or when it happened, because a lot of the teachers had been evacuated, so it was a bit hit and miss, I believe. But they certainly talk about their German lessons and finding it quite difficult. There's also a local name came out as a German teacher, so...
Yes, you were telling me about that just before we started.
So they... I don't know how much of that they took in, but certainly that it seems that there was some interaction, particularly when asking for sweets and things from the Germans or chocolate. They could communicate enough to
be able to get some sweets off them.
And one gentleman, he actually told me that they used to go out and ask the Germans for Zigaretten for Papa, for Papa. Father wants some cigarettes. So that, there was definitely, maybe being children, they were. Got away with a bit more, but
I certainly from some of the people that I've spoken to, particularly the ones that were maybe 6 or 7 years old at the start of the occupation, and they're starting to get a little bit older, or maybe even slightly older than that at the start of the occupation, and they transition from being sort of smallish children to actually having to go out to work as an early teenager, and finding things are actually a whole lot different compared to being that child at the start of the occupation.
I mean, certainly some of the boys then, or the old gentlemen now, but they were boys, and they actually said they actually quite enjoyed it. It was really exciting because Guernsey before the war it was quite a rural society, quite a rural community, and to see things like all the machinery, all the military machinery, and the train, as you know, well, maybe you don't know, but your listeners don't know, but there was a train that was a train line put in along the west coast to transport building materials for the different fortifications. The children loved it. Yeah. It was such a fascinating thing to see this train and see all these machines and the guns, and it's terrifying, but at the same time, for a young boy, it's quite.
I know that a number of stories about the trains. Actually, one gentleman who got into trouble, him and his mates, down at, I think it was down by Albeck, which is on the west coast, as you say. They when they were little boys, they used to like putting stones on the track to see if that caused problems. Until on one occasion, he got home and there was a German officer just walking up the garden path.
I heard similar stories at Perel. More than stones on the track, they seem to have got hold of some bullets.
Oh,
so that was quite exciting.
That would be exciting when they go off.
But you had the impression that things were very structured, and well, they were. But it seems that children were able to get into the lockups and nick things.
Yes,
and also wood as well. Some chap was telling me that they burnt railway sleepers.
I'd heard that story as well. That people were
they'd help themselves
removing railway sleepers from under the track,
but also getting access to stores. There was a lady who told me that her father had worked for the Germans or was involved somehow, and he was actually told, "I'm going to lunch now. You can have the key to the store." So they would give the German would give the key to turn a blind eye to a bit of pilfering, maybe, or a bit of walking away with.
I've also, I can't remember who told me this, but the Germans used to turn a bit of a blind eye to sometimes the children would jump on the back of hang off the wagon on the back of the train as it was going along, because they thought that was an exciting thing to do.
Yeah, and also that they would also. I've heard, there were stories of children riding with the drivers on the train. So, I think the life did carry on to some extent, and a lot of the soldiers we know were very young, and they were missing their families. It was war. They were posted here, but there was quite a rapport with the children and some of the soldiers.
And as a small child, you're going to get away with perhaps going into areas where you're not supposed to be, or getting closer to things perhaps
and trying it on a bit as well. Children will be children. I mean, there was another story of children faking a cycle accident, and they did this repeatedly so that the Germans would say, "Oh, do you need help? Do you need help?" and give them sweets, they bonbon. And eventually they said, "We know what you're up to," and they were rumbled, as it were. So there was a lot of
and a cycling accident would be really, really believable at the time, because if you look at the old Guernsey presses from the time of the occupation, there's constant reports of accidents with German lorries knocking cyclists off, German cars knocking cyclists off, and things like that. So they used to go into great detail about these accidents sometimes. So it wouldn't be at all unbelievable. So somebody's accidentally been knocked off their bicycle. Well, oh dear, better look after them, otherwise I'll get in trouble.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
One other thing that occurs to me about the radios, if presumably people that didn't speak English were kind of reliant on a friend who did speak English to be able, because listening to the BBC would be no use to them really.
Absolutely
themselves,
right. Yeah.
If they were doing it.
So when you wouldn't listen alone. Often people would meet at somebody's house to listen to the news, and they would have somebody interpreting
what was
being said. Yeah.
And I guess that kind of fits in, as you say, with being outside the curfew, which was somewhat easier in the country parishes rather than if you're in the middle of St. Peterport, you are going to get caught, fairly easily if you're out and about after curfew. What other sorts of things did people tell you about?
Well, many of the people I've spoken to lived around St. Saviour's Way, Perel, and they talk a lot about the construction of the gun batteries there, the Mirus and others.
Yep.
And having to, being told, right, you have to move out of your house. We are doing some practicing. So, and there was a story of some old chap who said, I'm not moving out. I think he was a bit infirm. He said, I'm staying in my bed. But in the end, the story is that they actually put him on a plank and carried him out. He was adamant he wasn't going to walk out. Well, he didn't.
Yeah, I can imagine somebody, as a stubborn country parishes chap who's been, doesn't want to be disturbed by the Germans. Although when they fired those guns, they did cause things like breakages of windows. You were told to leave your windows open and all sorts. But it still didn't help.
No, and it seems there were misfires as well and all sorts. Yeah.
Yeah. The what used to be the air raid warden got another job, which was basically, and the records are in the island archives. Basically, he had the job of going around and looking at damage that had been done by the Germans. People had say, the Germans have broken all the glass on my greenhouse because they've been firing guns and things like that. And some people did try it on as well. They
I'm sure they did.
They had existing damage, which they then blamed on the Germans. But so you see those accounts. But his other job was to go and make sure, if the Germans were test firing their guns or doing a bit of gunnery practice, he'd go and put up notices to tell them that they had to move out of the area.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got to leave the area between 8 and 12 because we're firing our guns. There was probably just as well people did move out of the area and there's certainly at least one incident I recall where a gentleman said that they'd not long left their house, and then he saw a ricochet off the rocks, which then went straight back in between the two houses on the coast road. Right. Yeah. So that could have been disastrous.
You mentioned push bikes earlier, actually, bicycles. There was a story and curfew actually that just came to mind of. He was a young boy at the time, but he was out after curfew, and it made me. I remember it well because he said he was cycling. It was around the King's Mills area, and he hit a German soldier out after curfew. He felt he was going to be in some serious trouble. All he said was, the German shouted at me. I said, "So, cheeky D, what did he say?" I don't know, he said, but it wasn't complimentary. And that just made, he stipoded campy more. And I thought that made me laugh. But it did show that the chap was out. He was late. It was after curfew. He was on a bike, obviously been somewhere, and he wasn't arrested or taken in. He was just shouted at and sent home. So,
probably couldn't be bothered doing the paperwork. Of course, you wouldn't have your lights on if you're out after curfew, would you?
So you hit Germans.
That reminds me of something more recent in Sark, must have been about 15 years ago. I was staying in Sark and walking back to the hotel that I was staying in. It was, as you know, Sark is pitch black because they don't have street lights, and came to a junction, and I just heard a massive crash, and two people had just cycled. They'd been going through the junction and cycled into each other, and I couldn't actually see them, but all I heard was, "Are you all right, mate?" "Yeah, I'm fine, mate." "All right, see you tomorrow."
They weren't crosswords.
No, they weren't crosswords. I think they were just coming from different pubs. I think one was coming from the Mermaid and one was coming from the Bel Air. If anybody is listening who knows Sark. But I guess that would have been a problem, wouldn't it? So you wouldn't be moving around with your bike light on. And
also on the other side of the road, which I think people sort of got used to, but every now and again you would forget.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That caused a few problems.
Yeah, because they didn't change it straight away, did they, either? So people were still carrying on to start off with. And I know when they did change it, it did cause quite a few accidents, because you see the number of accidents in the Guernsey press or the staff. They're recording accidents with people riding their bicycle on the wrong side of the road. But they did have some really strict rules about cycling as well. So you weren't allowed to cycle two abreast. And they used to fine people. You see people up in court in the Guernsey press, they get fined for cycling in line abreast. And in some cases, there was one persistent offender I saw who got a week in prison for doing that. In terms of other things then that you've come across, are there any other stories that spring to mind?
I can't say there are at the moment things that spring to mind, but something I wanted to say was that, I mentioned the evacuees not speaking JEHR-nehz-yay in England and learning English, but some did speak it a bit, or they came back and learnt it. And another thing that we don't often talk about is there was a difference between, the children that had stayed in Guernsey during the occupation and those that came back to the island. Children can be quite unkind sometimes, and I think there was a bit of, there's a bit of us and them.
Yeah.
And I certainly recognise it in the language. People I interview who remained in Guernsey during the occupation, who spoke the language throughout the occupation with their parents, grandparents, with their families, and those that came back and picked it up or carried out, had spoken it a little in England, there was a clear difference between the language of evacuees and the occupied.
Yeah, one gentleman noted in his diary that he took it as kind of an act of defiance to keep on speaking the language.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah,
it just made him feel a little bit, well, I'm doing my bit, the little bit that I can do by carrying on speaking the language.
But more often it's people speaking it, but looking over their shoulders and thinking, "Oh, people don't think I'm foreign."
No,
but. Yes, so that there were stories of people being made fun of because they didn't speak it properly, and so it doesn't encourage you to carry on speaking, does it?
No, you've got to practice to be able to learn it properly, haven't you? So yeah, that doesn't encourage people, I guess. Keith's just passed me a little note here, to say perhaps we could talk about Walter Breyer going to the UK with Torteful School as an interpreter. Apparently. Keith's going to fill us in.
I'm normally producer, but I did have an opportunity to talk with Walter Breyer, who is Yan's uncle. Is that right?
Well, cousin, so distantly related. It was Torteful. So,
okay, yeah.
Okay, well, he was a cousin.
Yeah. I was fortunate enough to interview and film Walter as he was coming up to 90 years of age, and Walter died, Yan, we established a year ago, at the age of, he's in his 96th year, and Walter came from a farming family right out in the extremity of the island, the parish of Torteful, and he told me that he was chosen for evacuation on the basis that as an adolescent he could speak English and Guernésiais, patois, as I call it, and the school sort of basically said to him, well, look, you're going to have to come along and act as an interpreter for the younger children in the school, for when we get to England, they won't be able to communicate. So Walter went to the UK and spent most of his time in the Manchester area, and he told me that when he came back to the island, somewhat reluctantly, back to his father, and we were talking about this before we came on air, Yan, that his father said to him, well, look, I want you to come back to Guernsey and stay here. And Walter said, I tasted the high life. I'd walked the streets of Manchester, and he said, one of the things he said to me is I had some up-to-date clothes, and he's actually said to me, I felt like a gangster. These are his very words. And his father prevailed on him, and owning a lot of land, farmland, in as I say, in the parish of Torteful, rural area. And Walter agreed to stay as long as his father reverted or came up to modern farming techniques.
Yeah, I've certainly heard that.
Yeah, and Walter did stay, obviously. He passed here, like I say, a year ago on Guernsey, and he was extremely knowledgeable about local cattle, and in fact used to travel the world to talk about the famous Guernsey breed. But his experience in the UK was that he was able to retain the language to a large degree and was fluent in it when he when he came back to Guernsey, and it was so. Thank you for letting me sort of intercede there. I passed Nick a note without any preparation whatsoever. Just we have been talking about Walter before we came on air. So anyway, well, I'll return to my little cubby hole next to the electric.
Just to add to, people did find not only linguistically they found it challenging, the way of life as well. I mean, Keith mentioned, the modern, living in a city was different from rural Guernsey, put it that way. And some of these people came back and they really found Guernsey quite backward in many ways. I mean, the outside toilet, for goodness sake, and that was not that uncommon. And people were used to city life, dance halls, whatever, cinema, and, indoor toilets, for goodness sake. So, it was quite a culture shock for a lot of these evacuees to come back to Guernsey.
Yeah, and as well, I guess to a certain extent, Guernsey had been a little bit stuck in time for 5 years because they didn't have, for example, the latest, English or Hollywood movies to go out and see. They had repeats of things that were still in the cinema here, or some absolutely awful German films. They're really, really. They either had the propaganda ones or really, really boring, horrible historical stuff that were just.
Well, that's your opinion. I don't know.
In my opinion, I've tried watching some of them, and I spoke to a friend of mine who's a film critic, and he was just like, seriously, you don't want to persist with trying to watch any of them. You're just going to be putting yourself through a lot of. Well, he said he'd be amazed if I stayed awake through most of them, to be honest. But
just going back to the evacuees returning, I think it was different for the parents then, but for the children that had not known anything else, that had just been brought up in England, to come back to why are we going there? And it really did. It wasn't easy, and as I say, the language didn't help things. You had situations where children would come back to Guernsey and not be able to speak to their grandparents or members of the family. So there was a lot of...
That would make life really, really hard, wouldn't it?
It was, a lot of people felt their home was in England, and there were stories of people coming here and just going back. They didn't want to be here.
Yeah.
In Guernsey, that is,
And I've seen one or two accounts where, where children were evacuated without their parents. They just went with the school, and they were... housed with people who effectively became like foster parents or adoptive parents for the duration. And they came back here, as teenagers or whatever, and back to their parents who they didn't really remember, and ended up going back to the UK because they wanted to go back and live with the family there.
Yeah.
Which is terribly sad for all
for everybody, actually.
For all of them that are involved in a situation that comes like that. And I guess the language difficulty would not have helped with that at all.
And it wasn't only the JEHR-nehz-yay. A lot of the English that people had picked up had a bit of an accent. I mean, everybody has an accent, but sometimes it was an accent that people weren't familiar with. So, whether it be north of England, or there were stories, I think, of people being evacuated to Scotland and coming back to Ireland, being treated as really quite, people were quite standoffish in a way, because they just found they didn't speak the local language, and they spoke English with this strange accent.
Yeah,
so linguistically, it was. I don't think enough has been written about it, actually.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, because, of course, a lot of people wouldn't have travelled that extensively either.
Why would you? I mean,
exactly.
As a tour guide, I often say this to people, that, the island really, it wasn't only linguistically, culturally, it really changed. I know Europe changed, the world changed. It was a traumatic time. But, you had people that before... I mean, why would you leave your parish, for goodness sake? The Guernsey, if you don't know, is divided into 10 parishes. At the time, the population was...
Well, there were about 20,000 left in Guernsey.
So is it 40 or... I can't... I shouldn't know the answer to this.
Around 40,000 in total before...
Yeah, 42,000, I believe. So, a few thousand people per parish, say, they didn't really, if you had everything you needed, you went to town not that often. You had what you needed in the parish.
Yeah,
I guess.
I still recall people from maybe even 10, 15 years ago who lived out Torterville Way and very rarely came into town.
The story is, where's town? What do I want to go there for? That sort of thing. Why do I need to go to town?
To be fair, actually, I still know a few people that say that and that live in the Vale. So
really,
not Keith, but
not Pleasant Common
and St Sampson's. So much closer to town. But you're right, people, and I guess during the occupation as well, that would have been exasperated by the fact that the only way you'd get to town from Torterville, you were going to have to cycle or walk. And you had to get there and back within the hours that you were supposed to be out and about. So that would make life tricky. I mean, there were buses for some periods of the occupation, but not very often. So why would you go to the effort?
Yeah.
I
mean, people would actually stay over in town.
Yes.
There's stories of people that went to school in town. They would actually have lodgings in town. So the island isn't that big. So it does come as quite a surprise.
We're 9 by 5, so that's 9 miles by 5, yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking there that there's a story. In the island, there were various bakeries, bread ovens, bakeries, and a couple of people I've interviewed ran one of those bakeries at Perel. And it's quite an interesting story about during the occupation and the fact that finding one flour.
Yes,
there were issues there. I think he said that they had flour for about 6 months, but his parents were, I think they were going to evacuate, but they were actually asked or persuaded maybe to actually stay in the island during the occupation to keep the bakery running. But it wasn't only the flour that was the issue. It was, of course, how do you heat an oven? They were coke ovens, I believe.
Yeah.
So, there were all sorts of, the day-to-day life was, it seems that there were always challenges, yeah.
Yeah, and just even down to not being able to get firewood at times because you weren't allowed to stop. A lot of stuff.
Railway sleepers, didn't you?
Yeah. But apart from if you managed to nick some railway sleepers. But we talked about it in one of the episodes, I think it was the November 41 episode, that, rules were brought in saying you could only cut down branches of a certain, it was like an inch and a half thick or something like that. It wasn't big. And of course the Germans were taking over large quantities of the land to use for fortifications, etc., which had been previously used for growing crops and other activities. So that was causing problems. So life was a day-to-day struggle just to get the stuff that you needed.
Yeah. And, the ovens were also used for the bean jar as well.
Yes.
The gentleman said, well, it wasn't really bean jar. It might have had a potato in it. So, there wasn't a great deal around, but they still brought their jars or their crocks for.
Yeah, so for those that aren't local that are listening, what would you expect to find in bean jar?
Beans.
But beans. Oh yes, of course. But it's usually beans and carrot, various vegetables in there, aren't there?
I'm not going to go down that road because people can be quite particular about what a good bean jar is.
Well, I know there are arguments about whether carrots belong in bean jar or not. So perhaps we'll stay away from that. It's like a sort of stew type thing, isn't it? That's with varying different ingredients depending on your
some
particular
meat.
traditions. Yes, yeah. And during the occupation, meat was very hard to come by. There were a lot of people that were pretty much vegetarian, because
out of necessity,
out of necessity rather than anything else. And you see that from some of the recipes that people used to write into the Guernsey Press and to the Evening Star with we've come up with this recipe for something that's vaguely like something that we used to eat pre-war. Or they'd call it something that's similar to something that they used to have pre-war, and just that was all they could get the ingredients for.
Yeah. So about the flour situation, that there was, I think, flour coming in from France, but again, that wasn't.
It was
really,
of varying quality.
Yeah,
yes.
it was of varying quality. And there's also stories of, that there was the German bread, the Schwarze bread, the dark bread. And there's stories of families where, this is what surprises me. People were hungry, but they're things they still chose they wouldn't eat.
Yeah.
And we're not having that. So, yeah.
Yeah, one person that I spoke to years ago was telling me he was convinced that the German bread was basically made out of sawdust.
Yeah, and cement and things, all sorts of
anything that could sweep off the floor, basically.
That's
no matter how hungry he wasn't going to eat it. So yeah, that sort of resonates with that as well. So we've talked about the occupation. Let's talk a little bit about what you do in terms of, because you cover a much wider aspects of the history of the island and the language when you're running your tours. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about what types of things you do for tours, and if people are either live in the island and want to go on one of your tours, or people are visiting. There's a lot of people have been in touch with Keith and myself that are coming to Guernsey for Liberation 80, but also they're much interested in much wider aspects of the history of the island.
Yeah, so it's quite difficult unless you actually have a language lesson on the tour. But I do often, within tours of the island, I'm always pointing out meanings of place names, which surprise even locals often haven't got a clue of what a place name is. So I tend to go on a bit, and if there's a story attached to that, then that all goes into the mix. I recently put together a tour around the St Saviour's area. St Saviour's is one of the rural parishes in the southwest of the island, and it's also where the island, or one of the island water reservoirs is. And it is a fascinating story. And the more I learn about that area, the more I learn. It's quite, it's very rich in information. But the St Saviour's water reservoir was actually started that they built a dam across 3 valleys, that they being the states, our government, our states of Guernsey, and that was actually started just before the occupation. Actually 1938. And it was quite an ambitious project. And at the time, we had a very decisive government, it seems. That was the time the airport was... that
had just been finished, just in time for the Germans to arrive, yes.
So, yeah.
We're talking about the reservoir, were we?
We were talking...
Yeah, again, if you don't mind, as Keith speaking, you don't mind me sort of interjecting. It's my grandfather was demobbed in 1938. He'd been in the Royal Navy since 1915. They were living at the Villette area of the forest, just up from the top of the Gulf. For those of you listeners that are, even if you're spread far and wide, you know your Guernsey locality. And he got a job at the reservoir. Now, my grandfather was not a patois speaker.
No.
The Markhams or the Majors in our family may have been, but I have no evidence of it. But he went to work on the very original work on the footings of the reservoir in St Saviour's. And I read a piece in the Guernsey Press some time ago, a long time ago, but I wonder if people can substantiate it, is that the most prevalent language in use was Gaelic.
It certainly
You've heard that as well,
yeah.
Yan?
Irish, yes.
Because we had many Irish labourers working on the island. And in fact, they remained here. And I think Nick and I have addressed this about their safe passage out of the island because they were neutral, or supposed to be.
Yeah, they tried to get safe passage out of the island, didn't happen. But.
Yeah, and grandfather remained working on the reservoir, which was an abandoned project. The Germans didn't proceed with it. But he remained working at the reservoir until late August 1939, just days before war was declared. He was called back to the reserve. So it was. We have family sort of history of working on the reservoir, and as you say, it was a major project. It wasn't picked up again till about 1950, I don't think.
No, it was earlier than that. Actually, they got going quite. So it was begun in 38, and then it obviously obviously
Short
it didn't
intermission.
carry on with the occupation, but it was actually completed in 47 and flooded it took about 3 months to flood. So they basically plugged the dam, as it were, on the beginning of 47 January. Within a few months, it was full.
Yeah,
there was a need for water at that end, at that part of the island. Yeah.
I know when we've had droughts and the water levels been particularly low, you can see some of the buildings that were lost in that time. You can see some of the ruins of those, and I remember my grandfather, who used to drive lorries, and he told me about going there to those properties to pick up. I think it was probably tomatoes or potatoes or something like that from those areas.
Yeah, certainly. That I think there were about 8 properties in all, and they were substantial.
It was farmhouse type.
Farmhouses, properties with outbuildings. But so the reason I started with this was about place names, and that there was a place name there, which there was a property called Le Vario. Yep. Which which has got quite a story to in Guernsey, because it's related to folklore, stories about werewolves. Yeah. So that's an example of how one can bring language into a tour. But interestingly, so you say the project was abandoned or suspended, should we say, during the occupation years. But what a wonderful spot! It was out of bounds to the public, and it was actually used for military exercises. There are many accounts of the Germans using it as whatever you call them, sham battles, sham battles, and there were stories of one. There's a story of a grenade, and I haven't got to the bottom of this, but an unexploded grenade, and some officer went in and actually it blew up, and he died in that exercise. So there were also other, how should I say, things took place as it was an out-of-bound area. Yeah, in military. Yeah. Mm.
You talk about military exercises, Yan. I remember, because my father lived through the occupation, and they lived in Saints Road, St. Martin's,
right? Yeah,
in Rue de Courtois. And he said when the Germans were on exercise, they would often push branches and foliage into their helmets and into the top of their uniform. And he said they would think nothing about barging into the house at night, and running through the house fully uniformed up. And he said, of course, being he was only a child, it was really quite intimidating.
I'm sure. Yes. Yeah. Talking of werewolves and things.
Yes, that's one of the things that I do find fascinating is some of the place names. So, as you mentioned, the Vario is connected with werewolves, and that just brings on a whole load of other, as you say, folklore and
well, you could go off on all sorts of tangents. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, and I find that fascinating that you get all these stories, but a lot of those stories were created for a reason. It's because people were up to nefarious purposes.
Normally, it was
smuggling
to stay out of an area.
Yeah, stay away from there. There's werewolves, or or you've got the devil's hoof print and down on Nancrest there, and
also that there are other
and lots of other stories like that. So I find that fascinating because they just seem to be endless. Actually, I mean, I've got the folklore book, but there seem to be lots of other ones around as well that people have been digging up some of these stories about the folklore.
So I mean, carrying on with the buildings, it's interesting that you look at the photographs, because there aren't, sadly, I think there weren't more photographs taken of the valleys before they were flooded. It appears to, the description of that area is it was the most beautiful part of the island. Many poets wrote about it in the 19th century. However, there was a need for water, and it was chosen as the spot. Yeah. But the houses, the photos that exist seem to show they had roofs on and doors and windows after the occupation. They'd been stripped. So that such was the need for wood. It seems that people did sneak in, or maybe the Germans themselves helped themselves.
Yeah, that wasn't
to roof timbers and so that's I don't know this as a fact, but it seems the demolition was helped along the way.
Yeah, it might have happened a little bit earlier than perhaps had been planned.
But also something else as well as part of the research. When you put a tour together, you as I said, you can, every time you discover something new. You just keep going on. And one of the things that took place is towards the end of the war, the occupation, there were some RAF aerial photographs of Guernsey, which are very amazing detail for the time. I find it quite, and you can actually, they're available online, and
there's thousands of them,
and it's really very accessible. And I thought, well, let's have a look at what the reservoir area looked like, so you can see the properties. But I also came across some what looked like, I thought at first, I mentioned this to you, Nick, I thought, oh, they look like bomb craters. Now I thought, no, they're too even. Yeah. And it turns out that showed up on the photographs, which there's no evidence now that I can find, but I mentioned it on the tour, is there was actually a battery alongside what's called the Nerve-Rue, which is near the Old St. Saviour's School, the community centre there. So, there's always things, coming to light that I was unaware of, and it's part of the tour is to share this information.
Yeah, and I've looked at if you go to the NCAP website, which has got a whole load of the photos from Guernsey, and there's thousands of them on there. It was a very photographed place during the time of the occupation, and it's great because the most of them actually say what squadron the aircraft was from, what type of aircraft it was, and all this sort of stuff. But some of the place names they attribute to them are either spelt wrong or just some random feature that so you wouldn't naturally go and search for that as a place name, but. Are you
talking the English or the German?
No, the English, the RAF photographs, where they'll have picked some geographical feature. So it'll be a rock off the coast, which is in the top left of the photo, for instance. But it's actually showing you a whole area of the coastline, which it would have made much more sense to have called it what that bay was, rather than. So, yeah. But just some of those ones, I've been scrolling through them, and oh, hang on, that's what I actually was searching for and couldn't find. And
I'm scratching my head here because I'm thinking that looking at the Germans gave many names to many parts of the island.
Yeah, they did,
I can't think what Plymouth is, but it sort of makes sense. I think the Plymouth, which is part of the island, southwest of the island, there's batteries there, there's a naval observation tower. Do you know the name?
Well, there's Keith speaking again. There's a there's a bunker complex next to what some listeners might remember as we still call the Fish Factory, which was Green Dunes, which was translates into German as Grunbucht, something like that.
Green, So sometimes they actually did take the trouble to translate what they understood the names to be. But
I mean there was a position that covered the Dog and Lion Rock of Saints Bay, and that they found a name for that. And so very often the Germans tried to replicate what we would know as the patois name into into a sort of Germanic equivalent. But sometimes they gave up and they made up something completely different. One thing I'd like to ask you, Yan, because Yan hails from Torteval, which is we mentioned a few times, but is a sort of at the extremity of the south-west of the island, is you may recall from one of our greatest ever books, the Book of Ebenezer Le Page, the heroine, so-called the love interest in the
Elizabeth,
Liza Carrickmore, lived out right at the extremity of the island, and Ebenezer walks from this part of the island, the north of the island, and goes to see her and returns home during the curfew. But there was and is a cottage there that's been by the Imperial Hotel that's been renovated. The Vitol cottage, you know that one?
Yes.
Yeah, and my belief is that many locations in Ebenezer Le Page are real. We know that they're real, and I often think of Liza living in that cottage down there. So those of you that have read Ebenezer Le Page, you will know what I'm talking about. If you haven't read Ebenezer Le Page, you should. It contains quite a lot of World War II content.
It does a bit, yeah.
Yeah, and it does refer to patois.
Yeah, it does. I mean, yeah, it is an interesting book, but it's the way it just like the occupation happens as just part of his story. You know, it's not a great. You know, the Guernsey people. There's something pragmatic about them that they just, oh yes, that's the way it is.
It's just
attitude.
happened, yeah.
Oh, the occupation. Oh yes, I remember that.
Yeah.
You know, the older people.
Yeah, the Germans came and then they went.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and there are all sorts of references to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if people want to go and book one of your tours, Yan, where do they find out information? Do you have a website or anything like that?
Just Facebook, really. Yeah, Yan Marquis Tour Guide.
I'll put a link in the show notes so that people can find you and keep a lookout for when you're doing tours. I've been on one of Yan's tours, and
the Plymouth one.
There was the Plymouth one. It was fascinating. I really, really enjoyed that, and so much information that I just didn't know about that area. Despite the fact my grandparents lived out there for a number of years, running some self-catering cottages out there, and I spent a lot of time as a teenager wandering around that area, but so much information that we found out on that tour. Yeah.
So you mentioned tours, and I think you've referenced the 80th celebrations of the Liberation. There's also the Spring Walking Week, which people are interested in walking tours. Not just myself, there just happen to be other tour guides in the room, as it were. But there's, this will be on the Visit Guernsey website, and the Spring Walking Week. Which,
strangely enough, last night I was busy filling in the form because I'm doing what tour for the Walking Festival with my friend Joe May. We're collaborating on. I'm not sure that's the right word.
No, right word to use.
Actually, thinking about it now,
working together.
We're working together. Collaborating is probably not the word to use.
And whilst we're plugging each other, can I plug myself?
You are the other guide in the room.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, my first tour of the season is actually on the 26th of January. So I don't know when we're in the 11th today, but the 26th it meets at JEHR Point. It's going to cover off JEHR Strong Point and look German positions around Saints Bay, Saints Harbour. And we will actually be visiting Loop Tower 14, which will be open, and the fire will be lit. We will be met by my brother, and he will give us a talk about the renovation of the tower. We will also visit La Marcherie, and I will talk about new information I've discovered about that. And we will return to JEHR Point. So anybody that's interested can get hold of me on keith@guernseywalkingtours.com. And if anyone wants to get hold of Yan, but by all means contact us at Occupied. What's our email address, Nick?
Occupied@gnetradio.com.
And you can contact us there as, for example, Elizabeth Mulligan, JEHR-nehz-yay, has done recently.
Yep. We'll be talking about that in the future episode. But yeah, the Spring Walking Festival is great. I think it's the last week of May, first week of June, isn't it? That's right. But there are always new tours that come out.
Well, there are,
which are great. I did help Joe with a tour in for the Autumn Walking Festival, and we were plagued by the worst weather ever.
I had to cancel several.
I think
that's just been a theme, hasn't it?
We cancelled. Well, postponed one, and the weather wasn't looking great for the next one. But quite a few people turned up, and we asked them if they were really sure that they wanted to go. It looked like it was going to absolutely chuck it down, and everybody said, "No, we want to go." And they very kindly persisted all the way round, despite the fact it started raining very heavily from about 5 minutes after we set off. They all carried on. So, but yeah, I shall look forward to seeing what tours you've got coming up. So I think it's probably about time to wrap up. Must mention as well, if people want to find out more about the language, if you go to language.gg, there is a whole load of information on there, some translations of common phrases and things like that, and a lot of history about it, and also how you can go about finding out where you can learn to speak a little bit of the language, which Yan very kindly runs sessions for people as well, which I know I particularly found fascinating when I came on that a few years ago. So Thank you very much, Yan. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on and have a chat and something a bit different, which our listeners hopefully will enjoy.
Merci bien.
Merci bien.
To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone.